This is the Benefits Buzz Podcast, your weekly pulse on what's happening in the world of employee benefits. Brought to you by your friends at WEX, who believe in simplifying benefits for everyone. Now listen up and let's get buzzed. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Benefits Buzz. I'm your host, Eric Pila. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Kelsey Burgad. Kelsey, we have a fun show in store for our listeners, don't we?
We have two of our own with us today. I'm so excited. And we often joke about how HR wears a lot of hats, right? And one of those hats is kind of marketing when it comes to open enrollment.
It is. I know. I'm so pumped for two reasons. One, we get to have our own internal guests on the show. We've had a lot of great external guests, but I'm always especially delighted when we can have some of our own wicked smart experts on the podcast. And second of all, this topic is literally when we were brainstorming topics, I know I just chuckled out loud because I think everyone can relate to this topic, but the communications that HR professionals have to do, they're like really important. And so, our topic is talking about, have you ever sent an email, right? And then someone asks a question like in your responses, as you referred to the previous email, like that passive aggressive punch in the face, right? Like, I already said this, right? We're all accustomed to these emails that we send and people just gloss over it. They don't pay attention to it. And again, this happens in every role, but when it comes to HR, if we're talking about benefit enrollment or we're talking about really important things that employees need to do, it's super frustrating. And so we want to do an episode around how do we create communications that get noticed, that get read, that get attention, and get responses. I think this is going to be a fun one. In order to do so, we have two of our experts we talked about. I want to introduce two guests. We have Emma Tupa, who is our product marketing manager here at WEX, and of course, Hayden Gothi, who is our producer as well as the senior content marketing strategist. We tore him away from the sound booth and have him on the show today. Welcome, both of you, to the podcast.
It's great to be
thanks,
here.
Eric. Thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah, thank you. This is a totally different experience, so I'm excited to talk to both of you.
Well, it's not your first time being on the podcast, though.
It's not, but I haven't been in the guest chair before. I've only been in the host chair, and we've all seen how that's gone. So,
oh, come on.
Well, you usually help prep the questions for this, so I feel like you're a bit of an advantage knowing that you probably know what questions are coming. But Kelsey and I might throw you a curveball, so stay tuned. And Emma, this is great. We've had a chance to be in a podcast in a previous life, and here we are years later talking to each other about a really fun topic. So I'm excited to talk about this topic. Let's jump into it. Okay, so maybe just a really easy question, but what do you think it is, right? What are some reasons why, and we're probably all guilty of it. That's what I want to say here. I'm going to be the first to say I have been one of those people who have glossed over an email and be like, oh yeah, they included that. But why do people do that? What are some of the reasons people might just kind of skim communications and really not pay attention?
I think the biggest reason is just the amount of emails we get. I mean, we just get so many emails and we've all talked about that, especially this time of year in the summer. You think about you take a vacation, you're gone for a week, you come back and you've just got a mountain of emails to get to. I mean, how many of those are really getting your absolute 100% attention? There just aren't that many. Even preparing for this episode, like I found a stat that I think like 38 or 40% of employees actually cited email fatigue as like a primary reason to like look for a new job. So I think frequency is the biggest reason.
Yeah, I would agree, Hayden. I think frequency is definitely a big reason. A couple other reasons, formatting, right? Like people don't know when to pay attention sometimes. So if something is formatted almost too formally, you go, I don't know, it seems like I don't really need to read this because it just seems like another table. Or it just looks like a basic email and they almost skim over it because it doesn't necessarily look like a communication. So you go, skim, don't need it. Bad copywriting too. I mean, whether it's too long or even like too short and you don't understand what your clear like action you're supposed to take is. If you get enough of those very frequently, you're like, don't need to read. So it gets to be sort of a conundrum trying to figure out, right, like how we get audience's attention because you're constantly playing this game of, I want to alert them, but I also don't want to bore them, but I also need to give them action. So it's a combination of things for sure.
Yeah, it's crafting the message, but also just like also determining what kind of messages you can maybe send out in more of a mass comm as opposed to like what are the one-off requests that you're actually going to put another email onto that pile of emails that we all have waiting for us.
Yeah.
I'm so guilty of that. When you come back from vacation, I will scroll through my emails and I'll be like, this one's short. I can get to this one right away. And this one, oh, that one doesn't have very much. I'll do that one. And then if I see a long one, I'm like, oh, that one's going to take some time. So I totally agree with you on like length and formatting, especially I'm one of those people that I look for like headlines in emails if they're really long. So I'm like, oh, okay, now I see what this section is about and I skim. So that's some great feedback. How would you tell those HR pros out there when they're working on their open enrollment communications? How do they know how to determine what's working and what's not?
This could be interesting depending on what type of company you work for, how large of a company you work for, or how you're sending your emails, right? So if you are perhaps at a larger HR organization, maybe you're sending your emails out of, a CRM tool or an email campaign or an email marketing platform like MailChimp, or there's ClickDimensions, there's a ton out there. And if you probably are at a larger company, maybe you're using something like that or Salesforce. And within those platforms, you can see open rates or you can see click-through rates. If you're including a link, which is definitely kind of what Hayden and I mentioned before about a clear call to action. If you're trying to get people to click, you need to give them somewhere to click and somewhere to go. So if you have the opportunity to use tools like that, we would definitely recommend that. Maybe there's an opportunity to partner with your marketing team, potentially to send those emails if you don't have that ability currently. Otherwise, it does get pretty hard to really know, like, are they opening it? Are they clicking it? But I know, Hayden, when you and I were chatting yesterday, you had a really good thought about another way to check.
Well, employee surveys are just another way too of periodically checking with your employees. How often you're reading HR communications? How do you feel about the frequency of those communications? A lot of the things we talked about with the first answer, how do you feel about the quality of writing in those emails? Do you feel like it's always clear what you're supposed to be doing? I think those are really good steps. And I think just feedback in general, I think, if you're an HR rep and you feel like you're answering the same question from people, even though you've already sent an email or a couple emails about something before, that's probably a signal that, hey, maybe we need to change the way that we're approaching our communication strategy.
Yeah, I know that's a reality. I know that's a thing because we love to follow SHRM, and I know there was a post where it talked about all the things that HR people deal with, and one of the common themes was people just not reading emails and disregarding things that are really important. And so I know there's all of our listeners are going, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, and this is why, and Kelsey made the comment this morning, this is why we have marketing professionals as guests, is because in a way you don't think of it as, but we have to employ, I think a smart tactic would be is employ some of the same things that marketers do to get that attention, right, in your own communications. And so I can already feel both of you wanting to give suggestions on how you can start to improve that, that to get that attention, to garner that interest. So maybe let's just open it up. When it comes to email, what are some writing tips? What are some things to get the ball rolling here that HR pros should be doing and putting in their communications to make sure they're getting read?
Well, I think what Kelsey just pointed out, a little bit ago about, the importance of the subject line, having a short subject line that's really clear on what this email is about. And also making sure that subject line actually is something to that audience that is going to, catch their attention. I mean, it's you want to make sure as much as you possibly can to try to personalize these messages as much as possible. And I think, there is definitely some guidance on how long subject lines should be. I think, it's roughly like 9 to 60 characters, nothing more than that. That's obviously a critical component. What else are you thinking, Emma?
Yeah, I think where it gets tricky, right, is I think a lot of us, even us marketers, sometimes fall into the habit of, let's say you have a newsletter or like a regularly cadenced communication. You go, Wednesday hot, newsletter coming your way. And that's the subject line every time. And it just says like 1, 2, or just the July, like the July newsletter, the August newsletter. No one wants to open just something that says August newsletter. Pick one of the headlines that you're talking about in there, like hot tips on open enrollment for 2022. That would get me to open it versus, October newsletter. You don't necessarily know what you're searching for. And the subject line is a really good way to at least get the attention of like one of the pieces you're talking about in a newsletter. So definitely don't do the standard July newsletter subject line if you really want to get people to open it. And that could be an easy way to at least get some open rates increased by using like a more specific subject line. Another tip too, and Hayden was talking about character length, that's super important too, but make it interesting enough that you would want to open it. take note of emails you get from other companies, right? Like if we're all getting emails constantly, especially maybe in our personal, what gets you to open a email you get regularly? Like I know I get lots of emails from like Target, like, hey, it's the weekly ad, or like they have new sales. Like what gets you to open it? And just take note of that stuff in your personal life and go, oh yeah, I did open it because it was cool or funny, or maybe had an emoji. And I think there's a way to be fun, still keep it, business professional, but there's a way to engage people in a way that you already kind of do in your personal life. You just kind of have to list it and place it into your work life.
Well, I want to draw attention to something that you said. You said searchability, and I think that's something that's so important, especially, going back to something that Hayden mentioned right in the beginning. I mean, if we're email fatigued, if we've got so many emails in our inbox that we can't keep up, think about your own behavior when it comes to email. You start searching for something when you need it. So if you're creating subject lines and you're creating emails, make sure that you're using words that people are going to search for, especially in the subject line when it comes to open enrollment, because then it's going to help them find it when it does become relevant. When it's the last day to enroll in their benefits, they're like, oh, open enrollment, let me search for that really quick. So I just wanted to call that out. That was a good tip.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, another important thing too, and we referenced this a little bit ago too, but just like making sure you're chunking out the content as much as you possibly can. I mean, anytime you can do like bulleted lists or numbered lists, especially if you're talking about like actual actions you want employees to take, is really helpful. I mean, because I do that too. Like, if I've been away from my email inbox for a little bit because I've been in meetings, or maybe I had a couple of days off, like I'll kind of go through the emails and what's really long and what can I get to right now, what can I? And if you see something that's really overwhelming, especially if you're talking about that newsletter format that Emma was talking about, it's just very easy to just kind of mentally gloss over it, move on, because again, you're kind of in this email fatigue mode. So as much as you can to like sprinkle in graphics, sprinkle in bullets, numbered lists, things that are really easy to chunk out and digest is really helpful.
Yeah, you brought up something that I have to jump into and be like, you talked about like what action you want people to take. And I know something that marketers do is we call it a CTA, or call to action. Like what's the one thing you want someone to do when they read the email, right? And we talked about sometimes a common thing for marketing is like, make sure the call to action one is really clear. Is it something you put at the top? Is it something you put, again, repeated at the bottom of the email? Do you bold it? Do you put a button? Like, are there any things you would suggest to make sure, thinking about what you want them to do, and how do you make sure you shepherd them to that action, right, in that email?
I think it varies on, the type of email you're writing. So in a newsletter, you're going to have a lot of different calls to action, and that's kind of a standard for a newsletter. So I think going back to that subject line, the one you really want them to take, maybe make that your subject line, or repeat it, throughout the newsletter, maybe at the beginning and the end. If it's a one-off email, my sort of rule of thumb is the rule of 3. So if you can do it at least 3 times without feeling excessive, maybe it's hidden within a link, so you hyperlink a word like join us on Thursday. That's a great phrase to link then to the webinar that you want everyone to come to for open enrollment. Add a button if you like, and then maybe right before the close. The other piece is people love PS. So if you have a non-formatted email and you're just doing it like a general email, so not really templated, if you add a PS, it's like 100% read rate. People love PSs. So that's another great spot to put your primary CTA, especially if you only have one. But if you have 2 calls to action, the PS is also a great spot for that second one. So keep your core CTA in that main body, and then you could slip in your secondary CTA in the PS. But
I love that.
That's one option. Yeah.
It feels like it's like a secret, right? So it's like PS, your open enrollment window is this date to this date. So it's like, it feels special, but also it's like, hint, hint, get your enrollments in.
Totally.
Well, let's talk about other things that might need to be included. So whether it's, again, I'm just thinking back to the email communications that I get. Videos might be attached. You might have a GIF in there. You might have handouts, attachments, and PDFs. Some emails have like a nice graphic header and footer and are formatted, and some are just text. Maybe talk through about what's the best format. Have there been any research on what seems to be garnering more clicks, or again, I'm just trying to make some parallels between the communications that we're getting and that they're having to create and what you're seeing as well. Anything there?
I mean, as far as I know, email best practice really, the shorter the better. It's really, try to eliminate the jargon, try to eliminate the hooks, and just really deliver a clear message that your audience is going to understand. And as quickly as you could do that as possible is a best practice. I mean, I think another thing too, just thinking about, even when you're talking about the newsletter format, for me, if I could go back like 10, 15 years and kind of give myself some advice on writing, I think as much as I could possibly encourage myself back then to really develop an outline and really think about get your subject line, get your CTA, get those main points that you want to get across, and then start building it out. I mean, there were certainly times when I started out writing where, I was just going with the flow. I would just start from the top and I'd work my way down. And so oftentimes when you're doing that, your CTA is going to be the last thing that you're going to do. And that's really not probably the best approach, at least from my own experience. So what you're doing essentially is developing an outline, even though it's not an outline that maybe you put together in high school if you were doing like a book report or something. It's just a much shorter outline, but as much preparation as you can do is helpful.
I would agree. Preparation is key. It kind of keeps your focus. When it comes to different types of formats too, I know it can vary based on the business you're at. So with what company are you at? What's your bandwidth? But we've really found lately that if you can include a link to a video, that will get a lot of clicks. And if you can keep that video super, super short, maybe less than a minute, it gives them a clear call to action. So a link to click literally in an email, and then they'll watch it. And then you can track views on that email or on that video, excuse me. So if you're using Vimeo or YouTube, you'll be able to see, especially if you don't have the ability to track the clicks, you'll at least be able to see the video views. So you'll know if people are reading and taking action. And I think too, Hayden and I were talking about this yesterday because we're both type A, or I guess I'm type A, Hayden's maybe type B, but we prepared for this. And recently, Kelsey and Hayden, I know you guys have been doing recordings for our HSA series, and you're just having people use their phones. And that's a really easy, low barrier to entry way to capture video lately. You don't need high tech equipment. You can literally use your phone. So that might be a great option for people too, to include as a formatting option.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that people's phones are every bit as good at recording video than heavy equipment is, and so the barrier to entry, like you mentioned, Emma, to doing video is just so much lighter than it was just a year or 2 years ago, really.
Especially if you don't have a huge creative team who can constantly be creating handouts. And there's probably we could even go into many more discussions about handouts versus video, what's better, what are people going to read. People get maybe handout fatigue at the same time too. So trying to mix up the type of, handouts, videos, if you're including it in emails, trying to do a varied approach will, I think, actually keep people's attention more than just the standard layout each time. So email with a PDF, every single email, that might not be the best approach. Mixing it up is definitely a good option if you have both the bandwidth and some of the help, but there are ways to do it a little more scrappily, with Hayden, with your phone, and it's just as effective.
So many great tips. We've gone through a lot today. We've talked about subject lines, formatting, different click-throughs. I mean, clicking out to different types of content, using video versus handouts. Are there any other tips that we've missed that we should share with these HR pros today as we lead up to open enrollment?
I'll defer to Hayden on a few initial tips. I know we talked through a bunch yesterday, but I know you had a few good ones.
Yeah, I mean, there are just so many different types of formats that you can use. And I think a lot of it is just trying to determine how best you're connecting with your audience, whether, again, it is, some of those surveys that we talked about, or if you do have some measuring tools, video, email, Slack, interest sites. I mean, those are all things that are commonly used by HR teams to communicate with their employees. And, some of it's just, some of it depends on factors like how big is your HR team? Do you have the capacity to really do a lot of really highly productive videos, or is that a smaller part of what you're doing? Can you build into your employee base, get them into the habit of checking an interest site every now and then, and maybe you don't need to rely on email so much because it's just part of their daily or weekly habits of checking an interest site to communicate. There are a number of ways you can approach it, and I think it really just depends on your audience and what they respond to, because every individual is different.
Yeah, and I would say too, even building off that, I mean, there are tons of resources, especially because HR is your primary function. HR or open enrollment is a big part of your workflow throughout the year. and it's not necessarily marketing, right? And getting out these communications is not necessarily your first nature, second nature. But it almost makes it hard to focus on like writing and like how do you think through all these things when HR teams are managing so much already. So like some quick tips for even like writing it would be to figure out if your company already has like a brand tone or voice they want you to use, because then you kind of know like what are your limits and bounds for like creating your actual email content. But try to make it fun, right? If you can make it fun, make it fun. If it has to be serious, make it serious. And even switching up the tone based on the type of message you're trying to share will capture people's attention too, because when it's more serious, they might be more likely to not delete it. But if it's more fun, then they'll know, oh, this is sort of a culture message, or more serious when it's related to open enrollment, but maybe there's some open enrollment incentives where you can have some fun. So make it funny and engaging if you can. Maybe develop a little personality to your HR comms, and then switching your tone based on the message. I know too, like with everyone not being a writer, Hayden, I know you have some tools just as our content strategist that you use even to help make sure that we stay consistent with our word choice.
Yeah, Grammarly, Hemingway Editor, those are all different tools I've used to just, really measure how simplified your content is for your audience. In general, you should be writing for a 6th or 7th grade level audience. And so that can be tough. Depending on the complexity of what you're trying to communicate, it can be really hard to keep things that simple. So those are great tools you can rely on, but, like we talked about earlier too, look at some of the other HR emails that you get, what do you like and what kind of blogs are you reading? What do you like they do? And try to implement some of that and see what kind of feedback you get. You might be surprised, based on your audience.
I love it. Those are great. So I'm telling my HR team to talk to me like I'm a 6th or a 7th grader, because that's literally how I needed to read emails. That's fantastic. There's so many good. I'm just joking, Hayden. That was a good comment, and it's very, very true. But there's so many good stuff here, and I want to thank both of you. There's just, again, I know HR pros aren't writers, but there's some really, really easy things, and you touched on those things just to think a little bit more thoughtful. Like just think about the way that you consume your own content and how you consume stuff on social media, right? You got to have some personality, and you got to think about how people are going to read emails. And the best part is just look at yourself and how you look at emails and which ones do you skip and why do you read certain emails. And then obviously, Hayden, I know you throw those great tools that you listed in the show notes so people can look at those and address those as well. So fun. Thank you so much both for coming on the show. Before I let everyone go, I just want to say, hey, if you love this show, if you love this episode, we would really ask that you would give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Apple Music. It helps our show get discovered by more HR professionals like yourself. And we also have something coming up, don't we, here pretty soon, Kelsey?
We do. We've been gearing up for HSA Day. So HSA Day 2021 is October 15th, and we've got some really exciting things coming. We're going to do some webinars that offer SHRM credits. We're going to have some industry experts on the podcast. So stay tuned, and we'll share more information soon.
I love it. Someone said SHRM credits. Everyone's ears just perked up. Thank you so much, both Emma, Hayden. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate you coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
WEX is in the business of simplifying benefits for everyone. Now, although we certainly hope our podcast sparks some aha moments, like that was pretty cool, but of course we cannot provide legal, investment, or financial advice. And, well, therefore, nothing shared in this podcast should be interpreted as such. We encourage you to seek out appropriate professional advice regarding your plans. Hey, congratulations! You made it through our disclaimer. Thanks for listening.